So it's my honor to introduce Esmé, who is the author of The Border of Paradise, which was named one of NPR's best books of 2016. And her essays and stories have appeared in Catapult, ELLE, and The Believer, among many other publications. In 2018, she received the Whiting Award, and in 2017, she was named one of Granta's best young American novelists. And she's also received many other awards, like the Hopwood Award for a Novel in Progress, the Lewis Sudler Prize in Performing Creative Arts from Stanford, and a grant from the Elizabeth George Foundation. And she is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Collected Schizophrenias, which we're going to talk about today. So just to introduce the book, I first encountered Esmé's work through her novel, The Border of Paradise, which we talked about for the workshop, actually. And in it, there's a character who has this sort of like non-specific mental illness where it's described really incisively. The character has like hallucinations and kind of like is experiencing a lot of things. And Esmé and I talked about this sort of character and you know, talked about her advocacy as like a speaker around mental health awareness. And so it was really amazing to read this book, which provides a sort of like reported, nonfiction, research-driven, but also like deeply personal look at what Esmé calls the collected schizophrenias. So Esmé, would you like to read for like 15 minutes? Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm so honored to have all of you here today. And I'm just going to pretend that we're all here to hear a nice, lovely bedtime story. It's a little bit of a weird bedtime story, but we're all grown-ups, so it's okay. I also wanted to read something that I hadn't read before. So I've been traveling around the country, and I've actually been in New York before. I did an event at McNally Jackson, and I did a really wonderful event at Books Are Magic for the Collected Schizophrenias, and I see some familiar faces here from those events. So I didn't want to read anything that I'd read for those events. So I'm reading something completely new from the book. It's the first published piece that actually inspired me to write this book at all. It's called Perdition Days, and it was written or first drafted while I was going through a very difficult psychotic episode in late 2013. And so I'll be reading an excerpt from that essay, Perdition Days. So what you might want to know before I start reading from the excerpt is that during this particular time, I was experiencing a psychotic episode during which I was experiencing something called Cotard's delusion, a delusion during which I believed that I was dead. I did ask for an ECT consultation, otherwise known as the treatment of last resort, because the delusion now showed a sinister face that I found untenable. Whereas I'd once believed that I'd been gifted an optimistic afterlife, this shimmering notion was quickly replaced by the idea that I was in perdition. In this scenario, I was doomed to wander forever in a world that was not mine, in a body that was not mine. I was doomed to be surrounded by creatures and so-called people who mimicked the lovely world that I'd once known, but who were now fictions and could evoke no emotion in me. I spent much of my time in catatonic psychosis, a form of agitation characterized by overactive movement or no movement at all, and I lay in my bed feeling psychic agony more excruciating than any personal experience of physical pain. During the perdition days, which had no rhythm to them, I could not summon the motivation to do anything. I would not eat. I often would not move. I would not attempt to read or answer an email or have a conversation because there is no point in doing anything when in perdition. Instead, there is only horror and an agitation that refuses to manifest physically for lack of motivation. There was the question of what to wear to my electroconvulsive therapy consult, which would take place at the University of California, San Francisco. If I looked too pulled together for the consult, I figured, I wouldn't be able to convey that most of the time I was suffering from psychic torture. If I looked like a mess, I might end up institutionalized, and I'd had enough experience with psychiatric hospitals to know that I didn't want or need hospitalization. Unless I'm catatonic, I do wear red lipstick and Chanel foundation. I do have short platinum hair. I do wear eyelash extensions. I sometimes go for months without showering, but I do not look disheveled. Friends text me for style advice. I have modeled, not professionally or well, but I have done it. I tend to look superficially good under bad circumstances. Having lost 30 plus pounds in the last year, 40 by the end of the following week, I'd adopted the hyperbolically named French ingenue uniform. In what was a profoundly lazy but effective look, I shimmied into V-neck white t-shirts and black pants, or the same V-neck t-shirts and a black pencil skirt with calf-high socks. I sold or donated everything else, much of it acquired when I was a fashion writer and still holding down a full-time job. A flutter-sleeved, button-down Sonia Rykiel dress I'd bought and worn at a writing residency in Toronto, two differently sized but otherwise identical silk Marc Jacobs dresses, black pleather leggings that I wore as pants. To the consult, I chose to wear the pants and shirt. I put on makeup. I say that I put on the pants not because I remember wearing them, my memory being largely demolished because of psychosis, but because it was probably too cold to be wearing a skirt in that part of the city. On the day of my consult, I helped C back the Ford out via hand gestures from the sidewalk. As I leaned against a parked car, hand up, two young men walked by. The attractive, curly-headed one turned his head as he passed. Yes, I thought, our eyes meeting, you may think I'm hot, but I'm also a rotting corpse. Sucks to be you, sir. I'd sold an enormous number of possessions in what I called a pay-what-you-want garage sale a few weeks before. C had seen my tweet and its link to my Craigslist ad the day of and called me about it. Everyone knows that giving away possessions is a potential red flag for suicide. I was already dead, so suicide never came to mind, but the idea of having meaningless possessions did. This unnerved the people who came to my pay-what-you-want endeavor, who didn't understand the concept of someone who wanted to sit there and watch people offer whatever they wanted, including nothing, to take away her things. Everyone asked, sometimes repeatedly, what amount I intended to sell, say, an elaborately knit cowl neck scarf for. And I had no answers for them. $1 was the same as $10, was the same as nothing. Some people seemed so confused by this that they just left. One woman grabbed armfuls of things and threw a $5 bill at me. The only thing left afterward was a red cardigan. I left it in a bag and put it outside, but no one took it. When C finally noticed the cardigan, he said, "But you love that cardigan." Did I love that cardigan? I couldn't tell if I loved him or my mother, let alone a cardigan that I'd worn around my studio for a year. I threw the cardigan away. The ECT consult was with a psychiatrist named Dr. Descartes Lee. Naming their son Descartes, I said to C. That is so Asian. His office was much less terrifying than the hospital in which it was located. Later, C would tell me that when he realized it was a psychiatric hospital, he'd immediately begun creating an escape plan to the car in case we needed to make a break for it. I am perversely thrilled that even though he has never actually had to stay in a psychiatric hospital, he has been secondarily traumatized enough that a 1970s decor with odorous carpet and furniture, plus random amounts of incoherent yelling, will trigger his instinct to run in the opposite direction. In the office, C told Dr. Lee that he liked his armchair. As he said this, I noticed the obvious stains on its surface and wondered why C had chosen that particularly disturbing thing to compliment. Were those sweat stains from frightened patients or distraught relatives over the years? Dr. Lee had a copy of Marbles, Mania, Depression, Michelangelo, and Me, a recently released bipolar memoir graphic novel, in a basket on top of his bookshelf, which I pointed out. No, I said, I didn't like it, but it might have been because I wasn't a fan of the art. I had 60 minutes. How much of it was small talk? He asked for my psychiatric history, though he had much of it already due to thorough notes from Dr. M. There was no clock in the room. I didn't know how much to tell or what to leave out. Pacing, they told me at graduate school, is one of the beginning writer's biggest challenges because a beginning writer wants to tell all the wrong things or everything at once. A nurse told us at the hospital in Covington, Louisiana, where I had been committed during a Christmas vacation at my in-laws, that we were there because we did not believe in Jesus, a conviction that he had extrapolated from one young woman's confession of unbelief during group therapy. In October 2013, I was told that I fainted on a plane and went in and out of consciousness for 4 hours, that I might have had a seizure, that I had not had a seizure, that there was nothing to be done. I was told to go home and return to the emergency room if I fainted again. I was given a neurotransmitter test and told to mail it in, which I ultimately did not do, in part because of the remarkable number of misspellings and grammatical errors in the instructions, and in part because Dr. M told me that such things were hogwash. I was told that I had lost 20 pounds in 2 weeks, but that the only physical problem with me was peripheral neuropathy, or a numbness and prickling in my hands and feet, which was determined in October to be the result of a vitamin B6 toxicity, a determination to be rejected later. I was told that my debut novel was still under consideration at every house it had been sent to, which meant essentially nothing. In October, I began to fracture, but I did not recognize it as fracturing, and I was told so many things that month, but I was not told that I was losing my mind again. A side effect of my condition was a lack of interest in food or forgetting to eat it, leading to weight loss. In late November 2013, I was fitting into size extra small tops and size 0 dresses again. I surprised myself by the swiftness of it. When I did look in the mirror, a practice that I generally avoided, the neurological disruption that creates a disconnect between emotional recognition and faces extends to my own as well, I noticed that my body had changed dramatically. During one bathroom visit, I lifted my bra, which had become baggy and sad. Bones. Someday, ashes. I ordered a new bra, which was black and edged in peach lace. It arrived. I slipped it on. It was somehow ridiculous in its sexiness. The cups barely covered. The straps were designed to look like a harness. It was me, but it also wasn't me. I took a self-portrait with my 1970s Polaroid camera. The resulting picture, in which I am doing my best to make a charming, alluring face, I gave to see. Somatic details figure heavily in these recollections. What I wore, what I looked like. I told myself through mirrors and dressing up and Polaroids and weighing myself, you have a body. The body is alive. But the more that I tried to remind myself of the various ways in which I did, in fact, seem to have a body that was moving, with a heart that pumped blood, the more agitated I became. Being dead butted up against the so-called evidence of being alive, and so I grew to avoid that evidence because proof was not a comfort. Instead, it pointed to my insanity. Why do any of these things? Why did I behave in the manner of someone who was alive when I believed, to differing levels of absolutism, that I was dead? The notion of perdition never left me when I was suffering from Guettard's delusion, but the degree to which I despaired about it did. Most of the time, I could stuff down the despair far enough that I continued to, pointlessly in my mind, brush my teeth, sometimes wash my hair in the sink, and report my symptoms to the phantom who claimed to be my doctor. Suicide was not on my mind, though it had been before during my depressions. Perhaps if I had considered suicide as an option, I wouldn't have continued to do what I saw as meaningless tasks and would have tried to kill myself instead. But as a dead woman, my condition meant that a successful suicide would simply doom me to the same thing, or to a deeper, unfathomably worse circle of hell. Instead of killing myself, I watched the Adam Sandler movie, Funny People. I was unaware of the fact that singer-songwriter James Taylor has a cameo in the film. When he came on screen, I thought, without self-consciousness, oh God, I can't believe that James Taylor is still alive and I'm dead. November 24th, 2013. Like a child asking for a bedtime story, I left my studio and crawled into bed with C at 6 in the morning. I said, "Tell me about what is real." I asked him about everything. I asked him to tell me who I am, what I like, where I am from, what I do. I asked him about my parents. I asked him if they are real, even though they live in another country, and I only see them once a year. I asked him about the president and about the vice president. He told me about our house. He told me about our neighborhood and the city in which we live. He explained where the furniture was from, that I'd picked out all of it myself. He told me about the farm table in the dining room. I listened as he employed logic to tell me that I was alive. "When people die," he said, "they are buried, and then you don't see them again. That's what happened to Grandpa this year. I don't see him anymore, but I see you." None of this solved the problem, but it did help. It was as comforting as a bedtime story would have been. I thanked him. He went back to sleep, and I went back to my studio. According to Greek myth, Demeter calls forth Persephone from the land of the dead once a year. I imagine myself as that pale daughter who, in my imagination, has become so accustomed to being among the dead that she doesn't comprehend her transition into the land of the living. For me, the Guettard's delusion lifts without fanfare. There is no moment when I look around myself and realize that I have been resurrected, no shock of joy for having emerged from perdition. I have become sick with other, more definably physical ailments. I undergo neurological exams and MRIs and CT scans for cancer, and I'm afraid, but I am conscious enough to know that there is no hope, even of death in perdition, only more of the same awful suffering. It stands apart from loss, injury, or perhaps even grief, all of which are terrible and yet are still beautiful to the dead woman who sees them as remarkably human and alive. Thank you.
Thank you, Esmé. That was so powerful, and that's one of my favorite essays in the collection, and that's the first one that was published, right? Yeah.
Sorry for my sniffles, everybody.
Oh, it's okay. So I wanted to ask you about the essay that you read is really personal, or the section that you read, but you also in this book sort of interweave like some really sort of dense, almost like medical language, and the opening essay is about your search for a diagnosis. So I was interested in just how you approached that sort of combination of this deeply personal story and then this also sort of like medicalized structure that you were sort of moving through.
Yeah, so I had come to writing nonfiction kind of by accident. I took one nonfiction class in my MFA studies, and I thought it did not go well. I wrote mostly memoir. None of the pieces that I wrote in that class were ever published. They were all rejected. And I kind of decided it was a whim and not really something that I should pursue further. And so Perdition Days was really the breakthrough in which I decided, okay, well, maybe I can write these more personal essays that are more memoiristic. And I think in part because there was such a strong topic, in this case, the experience of Guittar's delusion, which Nicole Cliff at the Toast, rest in peace Toast, picked up on right away, and she basically published it without editing it at all. And so in terms of the other essays, I came to them from a much different perspective. I had come to psychology actually from a research point of view. I was a lab manager at Stanford at the Mood and Anxiety Disorders lab at the psychology department, and worked there for about 3 years. And so I was a psychology major there, and so I'd written research papers. There is at least one, maybe two, published research papers with my name on them. And so I was accustomed to reading research papers about psychology and looking at statistics and kind of coming at from that angle. And so when I was writing the other essays, I was much more interested in writing about things that weren't just about me. So when I was putting the essays together, I wanted to include other people's stories and other information, because I didn't want to write a memoir, and I wanted to include, interviews with other people. I wanted to include statistics. I wanted to have information that was coming from outside myself, and some of that I learned from writing those research papers, but a lot of it was just kind of teaching myself that kind of journalistic style from reading a lot of journalism and kind of seeing how other people had done it.
And sort of coming off that question, I was curious as to who you sort of saw as the audience for this book, because it's such a specific portrait of your experience, but it also sort of encompasses like such a wide range, like sort of the idea of like a collected schizophrenias as opposed to like your own personal experience. So I was wondering how you saw this book functioning in like the wider world, and maybe who you intended to write it for.
I didn't really have an intended audience for the book. Really, my intended audience was anybody who was willing to read it. I know that there have been many different types of people who've come to me and been grateful for the book. There have been relatives of people with some form of the schizophrenias. There have been researchers from like Mount Sinai or like various other, researchers from various universities. There have been, clinicians. There have been people who have some form of diagnosis of mental illness, whether that be the schizophrenias or bipolar disorder or depression or whatever. It's really run the gamut. And so, it really is whoever is willing to read it.
I have two different questions that I want to ask you. I guess I'll go with like sort of the fun one, which is, was there anything new that you learned about yourself or just about like schizophrenia in general that you didn't know before, like while you were writing this?
I get this question a lot, and I'm sure the answer is yes, because I think that when I'm writing, and particularly when I'm writing nonfiction, I'm always putting together these puzzle pieces, and then when the puzzle pieces come together, there's like a hurricane. There's always this kind of like magic when the pieces come together and you're like, oh, like what an amazing, when things come together, it's like a really exciting feeling. But I can't ever think of like a specific instance of when that happens. I think, writing is always an experience of discovery, and it wouldn't be any fun if it weren't. So, I'm sure the answer is yes. I just can't particularly think of any.
Thank you. I really wanted to ask you about this thread that I saw running through the text, which is this, and I feel like it'll probably resonate with this particular audience, but this sort of idea of like these sort of experiences in like one's mental state and like one's trauma being like inherited, sort of like accumulated, like sort of like there are all these different factors that go into like making us the way that we are. And I was wondering if you could just speak about like what it was like to write about that and to sort of like pick up on those threads a little.
Yeah, so trauma and the inheritance of trauma and such has been kind of a thread through all of my writing so far. It definitely was with my debut novel. I took a class called Asian America and the Inheritance of Trauma when I was in graduate school.
That's real.
and so that was very much on my mind when I was writing The Border of Paradise, because I started to think of immigration as a form of trauma and like as a form of inherited trauma. With the Collected Schizophrenias, kind of the biggest example of trauma is the most obvious example of trauma, which is the John Doe psychosis essay. And I think that, okay, so I think like a lot of people here probably follow me on social media. And the more life I live, the more I realize that my diagnoses are more complicated than I think they are. Or, like diagnoses are not as clean as we might think, like there's schizoaffective disorder, but I also have like generalized anxiety disorder, but I also have like complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And then, there are many different psychiatric diagnoses that I have. And then I also have like this history of trauma that has led to certain diagnoses such as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And while on book tour, anyway, so John Doe psychosis is this essay in the book about the link between trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and my diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder. And I talk about this abusive relationship that I had with this person who raped me, who is a registered sex offender, whom I haven't seen since 2003. And so about a week and a half ago, I was going to the Alabama Book Festival, and I was waiting at the gate at San Francisco Airport, and guess who comes out of the gate that I'm waiting at? But this John Doe character that I'm writing about, that I wrote about in that essay. And it just set off this like horrendous flare of PTSD, and I was struggling so hard over the last week and a half. And it was so interesting because here I was touring and talking about this book and talking about diagnoses and symptoms and blah blah blah, and trying to talk about it from a very distant aspect, but I was also really struggling at the same time, and also very much in it. I don't really know where I'm going with this, except that I think that as I've gone through all of that, I've really been thinking a lot about how all of these things are interconnected, and how there is a lot that is intertwined between trauma and other aspects that might be diagnosed in the DSM.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for your candor. Yeah, I think something that was just super insightful in your sort of writing around the subject was this idea that, yeah, you can't really pin down what happens to sort of make us the people that we have become. And there's also no way to know if our parents had made different choices, who we would end up as. So I just found that really, really thoughtful, and I had never seen it phrased that way before, so I was really grateful for that. Let's see. Let's do a more peaceful question. I was really interested in the last essay where you talk about this experience with sort of mysticism and spirituality, and I wanted to hear more about just what that process has been like for you, and how it felt to maybe write about that and kind of make something concrete that maybe doesn't always feel like it should be.
Yeah, so the last essay in the book is called Beyond the Hedge, and it's about kind of these questions of spirituality and the question of could the schizophrenias actually be some form of mysticism, or some form of something like that. And I think what I've been thinking about that is the question that I often am asked, or these questions that I'm often asked while on tour, which is, these questions so what do you think about involuntary hospitalization? Or what do you think about laws regarding, I don't know,
also involuntary hospitalization.
Just these questions where people ask me what my opinions are about medication, involuntary medication, involuntary hospitalization, just like questions that I bring up in the book, but that I don't necessarily answer in the book, but that people think I might have the answers to. And it makes me think about like other people who might write similar books to the one that I've written, who are like called upon as experts for like NPR, for example, and then they're called upon. They're like, "Hello, today on NPR, there has just been a mass shooting, and the person who was the shooter was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and now we're going to call upon John Brown, and he wrote this book called Schizophrenia." And, then now we're going to ask him, what do you think about like involuntary hospitalization, schizophrenia? Like, I am never going to be that person. And the reason I'm not going to be that person is that the more I wrote this book, the more questions I had. And I kind of saw the book as like me starting the book with like, here's diagnosis. And here's me talking about like something I kind of know about, which is diagnosis in the DSM. But then as the book continues and I start talking about more things I don't know about, more questions kind of like flower outward and blossom outward. And then by the time I get to the very end, which is about like God and like spirituality and like mysticism, now we're just like out here and all this stuff that I really, really don't know about. And so that's where I wanted to end the book, is like out here where all the stuff is that I'm asking, and that I want to ask all of you once you finish the book, that hopefully you'll be able to ask yourselves. So, yeah.
That's a good answer. How are we on time? Do we have time for, I don't know where Felicia is. We're good? Can I have time for one more, or, okay. I wanted to sort of turn this, maybe with our final question, to sort of turn this lens outward. And I wanted to ask about just sort of like what you thought of like mental health care in America, and like maybe what are ways that like we can sort of engage in advocacy for ourselves and for people we know and for people we don't know, because you sort of touch on it in like various points in the text.
Yeah, like from a very like small, from a very small part, or from like looking at it from a small point, not like how should higher education deal with their students with mental illness, but like more like, I have a loved one who deals with serious mental illness. What should I do? I think like something that I was just talking about when I was at this event that my sister-in-law had invited me to, because she works at this tech startup, and she brought me there to do this event, and she was up there asking questions with me, and I ended up talking for a very long time about things that she had done for me, because I thought, like, wow, like here I am being asked about things that people can do, and I'm with my sister-in-law who has done so much for me. And I just started listing these things that she had done. Like she had, like people think of making frozen meals for like people who've just had a baby, or like people who have cancer or something, but they don't think about like making frozen meals for like a friend who's going through a really serious depression or something like that. But she did. She made like a whole freezer full of just like frozen meals that she knew I liked when I was going through a really serious psychotic episode, which I thought was just so meaningful and touching, and was useful because I wasn't able to make food for myself. So it was like two-parted really. It was like knowing that she was thinking of me, and it was very practical. Similarly, during a similar period of time, my husband put together this care calendar. Like, you can also put together a care calendar for like babies and cancer and stuff like that, but you can also put together a care calendar, just like, it's a free website, but you can put one together and online. And we put one together because I needed people to like come and sit with me because I couldn't be alone. And these people I didn't even know to call friends, because I thought like we didn't really know one another very well, just like signed up and like came and sat with me. They just like brought their work and like came and sat with me. So I guess like one big thing I would say is like show up. Yeah.
That's some really good advice. Thank you. Should we open it up to Q&A from the audience? Cool. Yeah. Do you have the note cards? Or I can start collecting them also if folks have questions.
Oh no, nobody
Oh
has
no.
a note card.
Where did the note cards go?
Okay, we can do this the old-fashioned way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Raise your hand if you have a question.
First off, Esmé, thank you so much for sharing everything and being so intimate about your life. I personally work as a social emotional learning specialist for young students all over the public system. And I have a twofold type of question. The first being, when you were growing up as a young Esmé, whatever journey through your K through 12 experience, was there a moment where something keyed you into something that you felt different about yourself from your peers? And what was one moment that really helped you, whether it was from a teacher or an adult or school environment? Oh, and the second question would be, what would you recommend, or that I share with teachers? More and more, we're moving towards trauma-informed practices, and schools are really beginning to understand that social emotional learning and understanding mental health is critical for not just academic success, but the well-being of a whole child, and making sure that we're equipping students with the right skills for life outside of school, and with conditions that we don't even understand fully now. So twofold.
Yeah, so I had a lot of teachers who were very, very bad at responding to my particular situation. But ignoring the teachers who were just like abusive, so we'll just forget about those people. I think that the situations that I look back at and I think like that was just sad. Like that, I just feel sorry for myself as a young person, and I also feel just sad because I think that teacher was not equipped to like deal with me. I think that latter situation is much more what you're talking about. I think the type of work that you do is extremely important, because I think the more teachers that are equipped to deal with students who have trauma and who have different emotional difficulties, the less freaked out they're going to be if they have a kid who comes to them who has like carved into their arm like depression is the best diet, which like I had done when I was in middle school. And like my teacher like just looked at me and said like, no, it's not. Which like, you know, I feel bad for him. Like, what was he gonna do? Like, he didn't know any better. Like, but I think like yeah, I think like just more education and also just looking for warning signs and things like that, which I think that you're also educating teachers to look out for. Just because I think so much of not only what goes wrong with teachers but also parents is that they freak out, like they freeze. They're like, they're like, oh God, I don't know what to do with this, like this weirdo kid, like, so I'm gonna respond in some kind of like way that hurts my child, the way that hurts this child, like without meaning to. And that is sad for everyone. So I don't know if that's helpful, but.
The question in the aisle.
Hi, thank you so much for reading. I really, really enjoyed the essay. A question I had, I had the joy of watching a panel with Roxane Gay. She taught a class, I go to Yale, she taught a class called Writing About Trauma. And she was talking about teaching that class and what it means to write about things that are very traumatic in one's life in the realm of nonfiction. And one of the things, and one of the ideas she presented was this idea of like holding, like there are some things you have to hold back for yourself just so there's still something that you have on to for yourself. And obviously this is a very deeply personal collection. So I was wondering how you navigate like establishing those, because I in my own writing, like I've been in a moment recently where I feel like I'm giving so much of myself away that there's nothing that's no longer any mine anymore. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are in terms of like, as a writer, establishing those boundaries and how you approach that in your craft.
That's a really good question, and Roxanne is very wise. And Yale is very lucky to have her. As you may know, I did not have the best experience there. There are things that I have established for myself a long time ago, and this is always changing, that I just will not write about. Like certain things about my marriage, I just will not write about. I think part of that is because it's not mine to write about. It includes someone else. There are also things that I won't write about because my body tells me that it's not safe to share with a larger audience. Like I will physically become sick if I try to write about it. And maybe that just means I need more time and like I can try again in like 10 years or 20 years or maybe when I'm like 60 or something, if I'm lucky to live that long. But I think, I would say try to listen to your intuition. If you're feeling that deep kind of like nausea, like, oh my God, and not like that very, very deep, like sickness, I think that would be my sign that I should not write about that thing. Or you can write about that thing, but then like put it in a drawer and like give yourself some time to see if you want to put it out into the world. Because given today and the internet, once you put something out into the world, it will very likely be in the world like forever. You do want to put some thought into it.
How many and which of these narratives do you consider to describe your experiences of living? One based upon neurological disease, diagnostic categories of illness, neurodiversity, intergenerational trauma, systemic oppression under white supremacy, existential crisis, or other framings of meaning?
I might not completely remember every single one you listed, but I do seem to recall that I felt that all of them applied to my life in some way. And because of that, I would say that all of them do, whether it directly or indirectly. That is probably not a very satisfying answer. But thank you.
I would say that the book deals with all of those themes in different ways and kind of does a really good job of showing how all those things might be connected in maybe ways that we don't perceive right away. That'd be my answer.
Thank you.
I feel like it's all in there.
Thank you for jumping in.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. I just want to go back to this question that, like, this discussion you had about, like, being treated like an expert on the topic. And, like, I wonder how you navigate this, like, because when we write work, we make ourselves into subjects for exploration for others, for people that we will never know. And I wonder how you navigate that space as someone who could be very much forced into this realm of being a subject for study, and how to maybe how you write yourself out of that, or how you think about that and understand your subjectivity as a writer in regards to people that will forever treat you as a subject to be studied.
That's a good question, but I also am not entirely sure I understand the question. I think part of what I kind of imagine that I like to pretend that I am not forever making myself a subject of study, because I like to imagine that this is my last nonfiction book. So I see this as kind of an entity unto itself, and people can talk about it and people can write about it, but everything within it is just there. And if they want to analyze it, they can analyze it. And but it doesn't really have an existence outside of what's within the covers, unless people want to probe into my life outside of what exists there. And I reserve the right to not give people that, if that makes sense. So, yeah. That might not have answered your question, and if not, I'm sorry.
Hi, Esmé. Thanks for coming and talking about your book. This is so important. So my question kind of piggybacks what we just discussed about writing about trauma and how you navigate those feelings. So when you write about subjects that cause you discomfort to think about other people reading, how do you differentiate between those truly uncomfortable writings and uncomfortable writings but you feel like are important to publish, and how do you get past those feelings of discomfort when you publish?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like, I think the biggest example of this question, or this question most applies to the John Doe psychosis essay. I remember when I was writing John Doe psychosis, at one point in the writing of the essay, I ran to the bathroom and threw up. And I was like, damn, maybe this is not a good idea. And And then I had to go back through my journals because I needed to verify certain facts. So I had to go through these like thousands of pages of journals, and it was extremely painful. Like, I really did not want to have to read those old journals. And then I had to go look at his Facebook, and yeah, and so and then there's stuff also in that essay that is about PTSD and how it impacts my relationship with my husband. And I've already told you all that I do not particularly want to write about my marriage, and I particularly found that touchy to write about because I write about how PTSD impacts my marriage. So there are so many reasons I could have just decided not to write that essay, and B, not to include it. But I decided to include it because there was something inside of it that I thought was important, and that was that thing that we were just talking about a little bit earlier, which is the relationship between trauma and other forms of mental illness, and the relationship between those things. And that was kind of like a knotty, like tangled topic that I hadn't really read about before, and I felt like it was important to talk about. There was one other thing I wanted to say about that. Oh, yes, okay. So I felt like it was important enough to keep the essay in the book. But something I would say is, if you're writing something and you feel like it's difficult and it's uncomfortable and it's traumatic, and you're really struggling with whether you want to publish it, but you still feel like it's important, make sure you have certain boundaries still in place. Because just because you want to publish this thing that's very difficult to publish doesn't mean you have to let all of your boundaries go. So what happened was, I was going through the manuscript with my editor at Grey Wolf, and we were coming close to the final edits, and we were going through John Doe psychosis, and he sent me back the comments, and I was going through the John Doe psychosis comments, and he had written, "Why do you not describe the rape in the book?" And so I sat there with that comment, and instead of changing it so that I did describe the rape, I rewrote that section so that I explained within the book why people want me to talk about the rape and why I don't want to talk about it. So I was still able to like have some control over this thing that was difficult to write about. So that would be my advice.
Okay, if there's no more questions, I think we're gonna wrap up.
Thank you, everybody.
Esmé, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for your wisdom and your candor and your vulnerability and wit. So there are books in the back, and Esmé will be around to sign them. Thank you all so much for your insight and questions.